Okay, now on to the phases of the moon, and more importantly, what causes them. Now we already know that the waxing phases are the phases that reveal more and more of the moon as they progress. So the waxing phases are down here, so we're going to be using these phases down here, the waxing phases, while the waning phases reveal less and less of it. So those are the phases up here, the waning phases. So progressively more of the sun, of the moon, and here progressively less of the moon. So now let's write all the phases of the moon in the correct order, starting with the new moon before we explain the position of the sun, earth, and moon in each phase. So in your notes, we're going to write each of the moon phases in the correct order and follow them in the orbit path of the moon shown in the diagram on this slide. Okay, so let's find the new moon on the diagram. So here's our new moon right here. So make sure you understand we're talking right here at the new moon. Now write the word new moon in your notes and then write an arrow after it pointing to the right. Now the new moon is when the moon is completely dark in the sky. Now we're going to explain these phases later on in this podcast. But for now, just write new moon and a right-hand arrow. Now in the phases following the new moon, we see more and more of the moon each day. These are the waxing phases. Now if you need to write that back in your notes to review it, please do it now. So after the new moon, which you've already written in your notes, write waxing crescent. And you'll see the spellings here on this diagram, waxing crescent. So here's our waxing crescent. So new moon, then waxing crescent. Then first quarter. Remember, you're writing these in order. Then waxing gibbous. So here I'm following them with my little pointer here. And then full moon. So now we're halfway around its orbit. So after full moon, write waning gibbous. There's the waning gibbous. So now we're seeing less and less of the moon. So we've got a little bit of it covered here. Then third quarter, and we'll talk about why they're called quarters here very shortly. So from waning gibbous, the third quarter, then waning crescent, then waning crescent, and now we're back to the new moon. So make sure you have that complete cycle in your notes. Okay, now that we have an idea of the order that the phases of the moon appear, let's try and explain the positions of the sun, moon, and earth in these phases. But before we do that, let's talk about the size of the earth and the moon in the sky. Think about it. So we're talking about the sizes of the earth, moon, and sun in the sky. Think about it. Because the sun is so far away, how far you say? You should know that it's 93 million miles away. And the moon is relatively close, 246,000 miles away. They look about the same size in the sky. So write that in your notes. Because the sun is so far away, we know the sun is huge, but it's so far away. And the moon is smaller, but it's closer. They look about the same size in the sky. That's incredibly significant to understanding moon phases and eclipses. So make sure you get that down in your notes. Okay, let's start with the new moon. So now we're going to take notes about the new moon. So write new moon again, and then we're going to take some notes after it. But let's look at our diagram in this slide. So it's important for you to understand the positions now of the sun. So here's the sun over here. The moon, here's our moon. And the earth in that moon phase diagram. So in your notes, write the position of the sun, moon, and earth in a new moon right now. Now, during the new moon, the sun is directly behind the moon, therefore the moon is backlit, so we see its silhouette. Write that down. During the new moon, the sun is directly behind, see it here, directly behind now the moon. Now remember, the moon wobbles in its orbit. Remember we talked about that? It wobbles in its orbit. But this diagram simply shows where the sun is relative to the moon and the earth during the new moon. Now let's use an example to explain this concept. Imagine that a friend is standing in the dark facing you with a parked car behind them. If the lights on the car were then turned on, you could see the outline of the front of that person, their silhouette. But their front side would be totally dark. That's what happens during a new moon. Write this example in your notes. Now remember that in addition to positioning and what we see from Earth, we're going to talk about timing. So on the day of the new moon, I'm going to get this down. On the day of the moon rises when the sun rises and sets when the sun sets. Write that down. It rises when the sun rises and sets when the sun sets. Write that down. So what we're saying is that the moon crosses the sky with the sun during the day. That's why we can't see the moon in the sky. So it crosses with the sun during the day. That's why we can't see it. Also write that down. What this means is that it's too close to the sun's glare to be visible. Write that down. Okay, now on to the waxing phases. Remember that the waxing phases, we're seeing increasingly more and more of the moon. So here's our new moon phase right here. So we're not going to move to the bottom now of these phases. Now it's important to remember now that the Earth has the moon in tidal lock. And remember what that means. It means the Earth rotates on its axis at the same rate that the moon orbits the Earth. So we only see one side of the moon. So when we go in this circle, in this diagram, we're only seeing one side of the moon. Remember there's a Pink Floyd song called The Dark Side of the Moon. That's the side of the moon that we don't see. Okay. Now, a day or two after the new moon, here's our new moon, a day or two after the moon reappears in the west after sunset. Write that down. So the moon reappears in the west after sunset. Now, by now, it's a slim waxing crescent. So here's a picture of what the moon actually looks like in our sky, a waxing crescent. And it's visible only briefly after sunset. Now, this is what some call a young moon. Now, why the name young moon, you ask? Well, if we think of the new moon as a sort of a newborn child, then each phase after that moon becomes a bit older. So if this were the newborn, then these phases would all become older and older until we got to the adult or the full moon. So, in the case of a waxing crescent, it's older than a newborn but still very young, so thus the idea of a young moon. In the case of a waxing crescent, the moon isn't new, but it's as young as it can be. Make sure you write that down. Now, at this moon phase, the Earth, moon, and sun are located nearly on a line in space, but not exactly in line. Write that down. So the Earth, moon, and sun are located nearly on a line in space, but not exactly in line. Write that down. Now, if they were more precisely on a line, as they are at the new moon, right here, we wouldn't see the moon. So it can't be exactly on a straight line, but it's close. Write that down. Now, the moon then travels across the sky during the day, lost in the sun's glare. So, write that down. So it travels in the sky during the day, lost in the sun's glare. Now, we mentioned earlier that this moon phase is seen 1 day to several days after the new moon. On these days, the moon rises 1 hour to several hours behind the sun and follows the sun across the sky during the day. Write that down. Now, when the sun sets and the sky darkens, then we see the waxing crescent pop up into the western sky. But during the day, for the most part, we can't see this waxing crescent because the sun's glare is too bright. So make sure you get that down. It's important for you to understand that. When the light starts to get darker and darker during the day, we start to be able to see that waxing crescent. Now, we officially call the next moon phase the first quarter moon. So look down here at your diagram, and here's what we see in the sky as first quarter. So write that down in your notes, and let's write some ideas about the first quarter. All right, first of all, it's called a quarter and not a half because it's 1/4 of the way around in its orbit around the Earth, as measured from one new moon to the next. Write that down in your notes, and then we'll review it in the diagram. So it's 1/4 of the way around in its orbit of the Earth. So here's our new moon. And it's now a quarter turn. If we term this entire circle as one turn or one revolution around the Earth, then we're a quarter of the way around in that revolution. Thus the name first quarter. So make sure you get that in your notes. Also write that on the night of the first quarter moon, we see half the moon's day side, or a true quarter of the moon. So make sure you write that down. We see half the moon's day side, or a true quarter of the moon. Now that also makes sense because if you look at this first quarter, we see half of the moon. Remember, the other side is the dark side of the moon. We see half of a half, which is a quarter. Okay, now on to timing. A first quarter moon happens 1 week after a new moon and rises at noon. Write that down. First quarter happens a week after the new moon and rises about noon. Now, the quarter moon is high overhead at sunset and sets around midnight. So write that down as well. So it's high overhead at sunset, so we can really start to see it at sunset, and sets around midnight. Write that down as well. Okay, now on to the phase we call the waxing gibbous. So down here you see the waxing gibbous right here. Remember, we're in the waxing phases now, where we're revealing more and more of the lit moon face. This moon phase comes between 1 and 2 weeks after the new moon. So write that down. The waxing gibbous comes between 1 and 2 weeks after the new moon. So get that down in your notes. Now during this phase, the moon has moved in its orbit so that it's now relatively far away from the sun in our sky. Remember the picture of the orbit path it takes around the Earth. A waxing gibbous moon rises during the hours between noon and sunset. Write that down. So it rises during the hours between noon and sunset, and then sets in the wee hours after midnight. So write that down as well. It sets in the wee hours after midnight. Wee hours meaning really early in the morning or late at night, depending on how you look at it. Now it's easy to see a waxing gibbous moon in the daytime because a large fraction of the moon's day side is facing our way. So write that down. It's easy to see a gibbous moon in the daytime because a large fraction of the moon's day side, the lit side, is facing our way. Now the second reason it's easy to see is because a waxing gibbous moon is far away from the sun, so the sun's glare isn't hiding it from view. So get that one down too. It's far away from the sun. It's almost as far as it's going to get. So therefore the sun's glare is not hiding it. So make sure you get those two reasons we can see the gibbous moon in the daytime down in your notes. Ow! Woohoo! Now let's talk about the full moon. At full moon, we're seeing all of the moon's day side, which is what makes a full moon look full. Write that down. We're seeing all of the moon's day side, which makes a full moon look full. So write that down. Now at full moon, here's the moon right here. You see the moon and the sun are on a line with the earth in between. So here's the moon, here's the sun, and here's the earth in between. Write that down. Now also remember wobbling. It's as though the earth is in the fulcrum of a seesaw or a teeter-totter. So it teeters up. Remember we call that ascending, and teeters down. We call that descending. Now that's really important for you to understand because this particular picture shows the sun in line. So the sun in line with the earth and the moon. Now this would be an eclipse position. We'll talk more about eclipses very soon. But for the most part, the sun is either in its, or the moon is either in its ascending node, so it's moving above the earth, or it's in its descending node where it's moving below the earth. When it does that, then we can see the full face, thus the name full moon. So, as the sun sets in the west, the full moon rises. Write that down. So as the sun sets in the west, the full moon rises. So when the sun's going down, the full moon is coming up. Now, when the sun is below our feet at midnight, which means it's dark, the full moon is highest in the sky. Write that down. So when the sun is below our feet at midnight, that means it's dark here, the full moon is highest in the sky. Get that down. Then lastly, when the sun rises again at dawn, the full moon is setting, so we lose sight of it. So when the sun rises again at dawn, the full moon is setting. So make sure you get those timing concepts down in your notes. Okay, now this concludes our discussion of the moon phases through the full moon. So go to Moodle, grab those questions on part 4, get those done and submit them, and then let's move on.